Hello, I am MJ Franklin. I'm an editor at the New York Times Book Review, and I am a local Brooklyn book nerd. And I am so happy to welcome you to the 2020 Brooklyn Book Festival YA Out Loud. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that the books by the authors in this program are available to be purchased in the link below, so be sure to check those out. We are here today with an incredible panel of authors. We have Mike Curato, Kiku Hughes, and Gene Luen Yang to discuss drawing our stories. What are our stories? As we grow up and figure out our place in the world, we find them or we create them. The pieces that make them up encompass queerness, racism, family history, politics, sexism, activism, sports. You name it, it is involved in shaping our identity. And again, I can't think of a better group of people to discuss this topic with. I'm going to start with Mike. Mike Curato is the author and illustrator of the Little Elliot series and has illustrated a number of other books for children, including Worm Loves Worm. Flamer is Curato's first graphic novel. Thank you for joining us, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Kiku Hughes is a cartoonist and illustrator based in the Seattle area. Her work has been featured in Beyond Anthology Volumes 1 and 2, Shortbox number 6, and the Alloy Anthology. She creates stories about identity, queer romance, and compassionate sci-fi. This is her first graphic novel, and it is a story that she's wanted to share for as long as she can remember. That novel is Displacement. Gene Luen Yang writes and sometimes draws comic books and graphic novels. American-born Chinese, his first graphic novel, was a National Book Award finalist, as well as the winner of the Prince Award and the Eisner Award. His two-volume graphic novel, Boxers and Saints, won the Los Angeles Times Books Prize and was a National Book Award finalist. His other works include the Secret Coder series, The Shadow Hero, New Superman, and the Avatar: The Last Airbender series. You are, as we like to say, booked and busy. He was the 5th National Ambassador for the Young People's Literature, and in 2016 he was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. His most recent graphic novel is Dragon Hoops, which is what we'll be talking about today. So I just want to say thank you, all of you, for joining me for this conversation. I'm super excited. I guess to start, I was wondering if we could just go around, and for anyone who's not read your books, which everyone should, but if anyone on this hangout has not, can you just give us a brief elevator pitch of what your book is about? I'll start with you, Mike.
Sure. Flamer is the story of a 14-year-old Filipino white mixed kid named Aiden Navarro. And he is away at a scout camp this summer before high school. The year is 1995. But I think you'll find that he encounters a lot of issues that are still relevant today. He is navigating friendships and bullying and how sometimes those things can intersect. Racism, body image, questions of religion and racism, all while confronting his sexual identity. So he's a bit busy himself. But you know, there are fart jokes also. Yeah, that's the basic gist of it.
I like that balance. Like,
yeah, there needs to be some levity with the heavy stuff, for sure.
Perfect. What about you, Kiku? Can you give an elevator pitch about your book?
Yeah, Displacement is the story of a fictionalized teenage version of myself being pulled back in time to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, who was born in San Francisco in the 1920s and was subsequently 16 years old when she was forced to, pack up everything that she owned and go to a concentration camp in Utah. So it's a story about rediscovering sort of family history, national history, and sort of the lasting effects of these sort of community traumas and how intergenerational effects still have an impact on us.
I learned so much while reading your book. Just this year has been a year of, like, for me personally, like history and deep dives and just trying to reconnect with the past. And so I was very appreciative of just like the story you told and how much I, as a reader, was able to learn and take away. We'll get to more to that later. But thank you. Gene, you're up. Can you tell us an elevator pitch of what your book is about, please?
Sure. So Dragon Hoops, I have it right here. It's about basketball. That's why the cover looks like a basketball. And it's really my first nonfiction graphic novel. It's part autobiography. I used to be a high school teacher at a Catholic school in Oakland, California. And our basketball program was just renowned. It was nationally ranked certain years. Because I was a computer science teacher, I really had nothing to do with that basketball program. But my last year there, I became friends with the coach, a guy named Lou Ritchie. He's one of the most interesting people I've ever met now. And through my friendship with him, I ended up doing this book about basketball. I never thought I'd do this because you probably can't tell from just like this little square, but I am not an athletic dude. Like I was pretty much anti-athletic when I was a kid. Anytime I stepped out on a basketball court, it would be like an opportunity to get humiliated. So I tried to avoid it as much as I could. But that year, following Lou's team, getting to know him did make me kind of a basketball fan. It made me realize why people love sports so much. So that's really kind of what the book is about. It's me becoming appreciative of this thing that so many people love.
So two things. One, I also learned a ton about basketball through your book, and just like, it was such a fantastic and helpful history for me. But then two, I, growing up, was terrible at basketball because I'm a small person and I could either get the ball far enough or high enough to make a basket, but not both. Not both of them. So basketball was not for me, but I was appreciative of this.
I think you and I would have hung out. I think we would have hung out like on the sidelines, Yep. Had we gone to the same school.
And then I just want to go around really quickly and just ask, like, what inspired you to write these books? You've all written other books before, but like, what made it, like, how did you know it was time? Like, this book was ready. I'm gonna go backwards. Start with Eugene.
I was in a weird spot when I began that book. I had just finished a graphic novel called Boxers and Saints, but it had taken up 6 years of my life, and I was like exhausted. I felt like I was out of ideas, and I was kind of worried. I had nothing else to say in comic book format. But then getting to know Lou, really the moment was when he told me the story from his teenage years. So Lou and I, we'd been on the same campus for about 10 years at that point, but we weren't really friends. I was kind of intimidated by him because he was like a sports guy. He reminded me of all the kids that used to pick on me on the basketball court. But then as I got to know him, I realized he's actually kind of a nerd as well. Like, he really loves reading and he's into comic books and stuff. And then he told me the story from his teenage years. When he was a junior in high school, he was at the same school that he coaches at now. He was a point guard on the team. They made it all the way to the California State Championship. They ended up losing by 1. He was the one that took the last shot, but they lost by 1. And that moment kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. And one of the reasons why I wanted to follow him during the season was because he had assembled the most talented team that the school had seen in maybe a generation. So it was his best chance at finally winning that championship that he lost out on when he was 17 years old. And that really, I felt like even though the details were different, his story demonstrates how often our experiences when we're teenagers still haunt us when we're adults. Like I kind of feel like that about my own comics. A lot of my comics are me trying to work out these traumas and things that I went through when I was a kid. So I think on that level, I was able to connect with this guy that I probably wouldn't have been friends with when we were younger.
What about Yukiku? What inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, really it was sort of the 2016 election, taking it a completely different sort of tonal shift from Gene's answer. It was I started sort of thinking about what the book would look like during the ramp up to the 2016 election, and then especially after the results came in, I was like, well, I gotta sort of write this down, the sort of parallels that were really being highlighted within the Japanese American community, like seeing these sorts of, the racist rhetoric, the fear mongering, that sort of thing, really sort of, within that community, people really talking about it more and more in a way that you know, we hadn't really talked about it before, hadn't really reckoned with it necessarily. So yeah, it was sort of definitely the 2016 election. And then as I looked into it more, I realized, you know, these parallels have been there even before the 2016 election, of course. But that was sort of my personal impetus.
And what about you, Mike?
Well, you know, growing up, I didn't really see myself in the pages of books. I didn't see other biracial, chubby gay kids very much. And I feel like, you know, queer youth is extremely underserved in literature. And, you know, so is non-queer youth because they don't get exposure. They're not able to look into that world and see what it could be like and gain some empathy from it. So just as Gene said that, you know, he deals with past traumas in his books. I mean, this, you know, I was working through a lot of my own experiences. This is fiction, but it's based very much on personal life experience that I thought could be relatable for folks. And, you know, there is suicide ideation in the book. I think it is, I know it is a massive problem in our culture. Queer youth are statistically much higher, at a much higher risk of self-harm, homelessness, and suicide. If that queer youth is trans and or a person of color, those statistics rise drastically. So this is a book that I wanted to write to try to help my community, to say to queer youth, you deserve to be here and take up space, and you don't have to be straight and white and athletic to deserve to be treated with respect and loved. So that's why.
That's a great point that you bring up, which is like how important representation matters and how so many people don't see themselves on the page. And I was wondering, to that end, like, we're writing about identities, but how did you figure out that these are the stories that you wanted to tell to explore these identities? And I wanted to start with Yukiku, because your story kind of involves like time travel or memory travel, and like there's this exploration of a present identity and a heritage by going back in the past. And so I was wondering how you landed on this particular story and this structure.
Yeah, I think, yeah, identity is definitely a tricky thing, especially, I think Mike also knows, when you're biracial, it's sort of like figuring out where you fit in either community is a big part of figuring out who you are as a kid and as an adult even. Yeah, and I think I touch on that briefly in the book, just in terms of there's a moment where Kiku's in line getting registered for registering as a Japanese American for future removal. And somebody in line asks her, are you sure you belong here? Because, you know, I'm white passing in a lot of instances. So it's like, and there weren't a lot of mixed race kids at the time. So yeah, it was sort of me sort of working through what it means to be legally Japanese American to the extent that you would be put in a camp, but not physically looking like how people expect Japanese Americans to look. That was sort of, yeah, sort of me navigating that identity. But yeah, and in terms of time travel, sorry if this is not answering your exact question. But yeah, I think the time travel element for me was really important in that, because there's so much that I feel like I couldn't explain or couldn't know necessarily the specifics of. So I used time travel in the book as a way to sort of circumvent or explain the gaps in my own knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was reading, I was like looking through my notes. I have just like loose papers like everywhere. So that's where I am in 2020. But I wrote that down, that moment where you said, "Are you sure you belong here?" When your character is in line in the past and someone asks, and I thought that was such a rich moment because that's a question. Whether we're time traveling or not, that we always consider: Are we sure we belong here? Like where, as we're forming our identities and conveying our identities, like that's something that we're always grappling with. And so the idea of going back into the past to try to like figure that out or explore that sense of belonging was so interesting to me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it does add an extra element when you think, this is how I feel. Do I belong here? But the government is telling you you belong here. It's sort of like the ways that our identities are classified by different agencies, different groups, etc. Like, yeah, it can be very conflicting.
And that's a good segue to Mike in your book, because I feel like in your book, we have a character, we have Aiden, who's figuring it out. He's trying to, he's also saying like, do I belong here? But like in a different type of way. He's trying to figure out like, who am I? Like, do I feel okay with who I am? Do I belong here? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that journey of discovery as seen throughout your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, Kiku was basically just talking about intersectionality. And, with my character, I wanted to explore how we can identify as different things that can also conflict with each other. For example, Aiden is realizing he's queer, but he's also devoutly Catholic. He wants to be a good Christian, he wants to be a good person, and he's trying to reconcile those two identities. The question of, am I supposed to be here, takes on like the big question of like, am I supposed to be here? Because he feels like, rather than embracing being an enigma and being like, I am, therefore, what is it? I exist, therefore I am. He's 14. And so when the powers that be are telling you, well, there's only this one way to be, I think that's the mark of growing up, right? Is embracing who you are despite what the world tells you who you are. Only you know who you are. So just what you said, Aiden is figuring it out, and it can be a really tough journey to get there.
And I have a kind of like a chicken and egg question, which is like, this is such a big theme and a big topic. And how did you figure out how to explore that theme through this story? Like, did you decide like, I want to write a story about camp and then these themes followed? Or did you have the idea of exploring identity and you're like, oh, camp is such a perfect place to explore this? Like, how did you figure out this?
I'm not sure. I worked on this book for so long. It was an idea I had so long ago. I started I thought about it even longer than this, but I think 2011 is when I started writing it. And then I sold it in like 2014. So I know I had just all these ideas about wanting to do a graphic novel, to do one about queer youth. And I just kind of had like a brain dump of like all of my experiences, all of my traumas, and the things that I loved about my teenage years. And scouting, speaking of intersectionality, I mean, it did so much for me, while at the same time it was, this institution that kind of upheld these really homophobic ideas. So I think that's representative of the world that we live in. There is no real utopia, right? There's always going to be something Um, um, yeah, so I think camp emerged as like, summer camp was like the highlight of my year as a teenager. I had so much joy about it, but also I talk about in the afterword how, you know, this is fiction, but it's based on experience. But the one scene from the book that's just like taken out of my memory is the suicide ideation scene. And I think that's important for my readers to know that I've been there and I've grappled with that big question, because I think most people at some point in their life do grapple with that, but not many people want to talk about that because it's so personal. So that happened for me at a scout camp, right? So so I guess there is an egg to your question. It was that memory that the whole book is really structured around. Like that is the critical moment. Also, I'm realizing I messed up that quote before, isn't it? Like, I think, therefore I am. Anyway, I know there's so many people like, oh, it's not the quote. It's not. You know what I mean.
And then I wanted to throw it over to you, Gene, because you mentioned a little bit about how you came to this story. But while reading, I felt like I had like Hans Zimmer Inception, like horns blaring, because there's so many layers to the story. It's you learning more about Lou's story and telling Lou's story and thinking about how to tell Lou's story. But then also there's this history of basketball too, interspersed. So it's like, which dreamscape are we in? And I just wanted to know, like, how did you, once you learn Lou's story, you're like, this is rich. I need to write about this. How did you figure out how you wanted to tell this story?
Yeah, when I originally proposed the book, I had proposed it as a 200-page book, and I wasn't planning on being in it at all. I was just going to focus on the coaches and the players on the team. But then I knew nothing about basketball, so I started reading all of these books about basketball history, and I became really fascinated with a lot of the historical figures. You know, like Georgianne Wells, the first woman to dunk, and Georgia Meekan, who was the first NBA superstar. And then I also started getting freaked out because these were real people that I was writing about, right? Like not just the historical figures, but the actual team. So as I was interviewing them, I felt like with some of them, like with some of the players, they wanted to share parts of their lives, but not others, which I thought was super fair. But as a storyteller, like when I'm telling fictional stories, I have complete access to all of the feelings and all of the thoughts of all of the characters. So I wasn't sure how to approach a story where some of the access was limited. In the end, I felt like I had to put myself in just to deal with a lot of those weaknesses. Like I had to be real with the reader about the fact that I didn't know much about basketball when I began the project. I had to be real with the reader about how I didn't have access or even the rights to some of the stories of some of these kids and these coaches. And then it just got like, it just felt like it got so, it felt so unwieldy that I had to put all of the unwieldiness onto paper, to be honest with the reader.
That's one of the things I appreciated about it, because there are several moments in your book where your character is like, how am I going to tell this story? And then later you're wondering about, like, I need this information from this coach, but I can't put this coach in the story. Like, and like you see this character grappling with how you tell this story. And something you just said that I was super interested in is like, there were players and coaches that like wanted, you have a responsibility to them in telling their story in a certain way. But I think that all of the books on this panel kind of grapple with that, which is like that idea of responsibility in conveying whatever story or whatever identity. I was wondering, like, Kiku, Mike, how did you think about that too?
Kiku?
Well, yeah, that was a big issue for me, especially I think when it came to my grandmother, who I never met. She died before I was born. but my mom obviously knew her mother, and this issue of how to represent a person that I never met, but many people in my family knew very intimately, was a huge struggle, which is sort of inspired by the decision not to ever have my character and my grandmother's character interact, was because I didn't think I would be able to do justice or represent her correctly. So even though it is a family story, I made it much more about the way that when you search for your family history, sometimes there are things that you can't access, but you can still learn about the context in which they lived and the world that they inhabited, and the people, the opinions and the voices that they would have been surrounded by, which is its own sort of authentic truth in how her life was, I think. Yeah, but definitely that was a big issue. Still grappling with.
What about you, Mike? How did you grapple with that idea of like responsibility of like how you're conveying certain identities?
Well, when I was writing the characters, developing the characters, they're kind of amalgamations of people throughout my life, and even developing Aiden as a character. I mean, there's a lot of me in Aiden, but he is also his own unique character. I can say that he is a lot braver than I was when I was 14. He definitely did things that I would never think of doing when I was 14. It may enter my mind, but I'd be like, oh, shh, no. La 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 la. So it was kind of interesting thinking about like placing myself into those uncomfortable situations from the past and thinking about how I would have dealt with it, how I could have dealt with it differently, or what would I do now, or I think the hardest part for me, even though this is fiction, was revisiting my past and reliving all of that hurt. And there were days that I had to be very selective with what I could work on, because it was kind of mentally exhausting. So there were days that I'm like, I don't have the strength, so I'm gonna work on the X-Men spoof, or the Lord of the Rings spoof, or the fart joke, or whatever, or paint some lovely trees. That's nice. And then there were days that I could just be really objective, and those were the times that I was like, okay, take advantage of this moment and just go in to do the hard stuff. I'm not sure if I just totally strayed from your question, but
question and preempts another question that I actually had, which is
great.
Like, all these books are so deeply personal too, and whenever you are sharing your story, representing yourself, you always have to figure out like how much do you share and what do you hold back, what do you hold on to your for yourself, and I was wondering how you figured that out while you were writing all of your books. I'm going to start with you, Mike, actually, since you preempted the question. So.
Well, lucky me, my book is fiction. So, and I've only owned up to, that one part. So I think, I actually think I was really honest I put a lot of myself into this book, actually. I feel very exposed with this book. And I feel very vulnerable with it. That being said, I think, when a book has an element of truth, when there's truth running through the story, even if it's fiction, that's what's going to resonate. That's what is going to make an impact. So that's why I chose to go the vulnerable route. Yeah.
What about you, Gene? You mentioned a little bit earlier that you were sharing these other stories of Lou but then you realize that, like, in order to work through some of the topics, you needed to put yourself in the book. How did you figure out, like, how much you would represent of yourself, how much of a presence you would be, what parts of yourself that you shared? How did you think through that?
Well, I do want to say first, with Mike's book. So I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy of Mike's book, and it was awesome. It was amazing. It took me a little while to figure out that it was fiction because it felt so real. I think it took I went through and I was like, oh, the first name is actually different. And at first I was like, oh, did he have like a pet name when he was a kid that's different from Mike? Because it just felt so. I mean, it was authentic. It felt like it came from a really authentic place, and I think the vulnerability that you're talking about, Mike, just totally comes through. It bleeds through the
Thanks,
pages.
Gene.
Yeah.
I mean, I do look like Aiden looks like me, like, so, you know, I get that.
Yeah, I mean, I think reading that book, I just thought it must have been scary to put it out. You know, it must have been scary to put it out. So, and that kind of fear, I feel like is a little bit of a gauge, just in general, when you're writing stories. So for this one, you know, at the beginning, when I first started working on Dragon Hoops, I wasn't planning on being in it at all, and then I put myself in the prologue and the epilogue. I showed it around to an internal reading group. First Second Books, my publisher, has this internal reading group where a bunch of the cartoonists that are published by them will look at each other's stuff and give notes. And that reading group told me that I had to put more of myself in. So I did. And ultimately, the gauge that I used wasn't really any kind of rule that I had in my head. It was just more of a feeling. Like if I started feeling scared about the amount of vulnerability I was putting on the page, I felt like I was doing it right. You know, like, so it was like, it didn't feel good, but it felt right.
Yeah, that's a good instinct, like that I've just heard someone gave me as advice of just like of being in the world, which is like trust your gut. Like if you're doing something feels off, or if you're like sharing, like just like trust your instincts. I love that, like that came into play too when writing your book. What about Yukiku? You mentioned mentioning like how you mentioned how much of your grandmother you wanted to put in, but how much of yourself did you want to put in? How did you think through that?
Yeah, I feel like my character really was the purpose of my character was really just as a lens looking, you know, at this sort of situation that I felt a part of, but also completely separated from, which I think is the case for a lot of people looking back at U.S. history, especially in the way that it's, you know, sort of typically taught as this sort of distance between, you know, who we are now as a nation versus, you know, the things that we did back then, which were bad, but that's nothing to do with us, sort of. And so I feel like my character was really kind of like a stand-in for, you know, any modern person sort of looking back at the pieces of history that are hard to access, but are also, you know, so deeply woven into the present day. But I also think I grew up without a lot of connection to the Japanese American community because, you know, everyone was so scattered after camp, and my family didn't go back to a Japantown. So there was kind of like a separation between sort of us and the community that continued to exist. And so I felt like I had a certain amount of freedom that I didn't have a lot. I mean, I had some, but I didn't have a lot of the baggage of, there are certain aspects of incarceration that I think people are still very hesitant to talk about. The No-No Boys being one, which were a group of people who basically had an active protest in camp that had them labeled as disloyal by the US government and by a lot of their fellow inmates. And that sort of was treated as kind of a shame in the Japanese American community because they were troublemakers, etc. But I grew up without having that kind of baggage or that kind of feeling of community shame, I guess,
Yep.
that allowed me to have a little bit more freedom of what I was able to sort of delve into, I think.
Yep. And then pivoting a little bit, I wanted to ask, so we're telling these stories, we're sharing ourselves, but these are graphic novels, and that form presents other challenges and opportunities. And I was wondering if you could, I'll talk through like what were you were thinking about as you were putting pen to page and ink to page, and like, I mean all of that, like how what challenge and opportunities to telling your stories through graphics present. I'm going to start with you, Mike, because your book, it's black and white except for these reds and oranges that so stand out. And so not just color, but just in general, like how did you think about the visuals that went along with your book?
Well, as you mentioned, this is my first graphic novel. So I think for 3 months, I just like screamed in a room. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing.
2020, I've been doing the same thing.
Yeah. So it was a little exercise, a little warm up for 2020. So, but I did know for sure that I wanted this to be a graphic novel because comics are what I read when I was 14 and kind of saved me as a reader. So it was very purposeful to go with this format. And so I was kind of learning on the fly. You know, it's one of those things where you're like, I've read so many comics my whole life. What could go wrong? But so there was a lot of like learning curve stuff. But with the art style, I knew that I wanted it to have a little more rawness to it than my usual artwork, which leans more polished. So it took me a long time to develop this style, which ended up being, the line work is black colored pencil with India ink wash, and then like colored inks for the spot color. Yeah, I kind of knew from the jump that I wanted it to be black and white, because again, to go along with the starkness of the story, but then to have the fire be this visual thread that could guide the reader visually throughout the story, and can kind of highlight moments of intense emotion that range from anger to fear to love. And so there, you know, there's fire, there's there are inanimate objects sometimes that are highlighted with reds or oranges.
There are incredible scenes of The Lord of the Rings with red.
There are there are some dream sequences that were like some of my favorite scenes to illustrate. Love a good spoof. Yeah, and it was fun to draw. Like I really loved, once the agony was figuring out the style, but once I had it, things started moving along.
What about Yukiku? How did you figure out the style, and what challenges and opportunities were presented by telling the story through a graphic novel?
Yeah, there are two things about it being a graphic novel that I think are really interesting. The first being that there's such a limited amount of visual history about this time, about incarceration, specifically because people weren't allowed to bring cameras to camp. They were sort of banned. I don't exactly know why. It was one of those paranoia things. So there were official photographers, like Dorothea Lange was a WPA photographer who was able to go into camp and take photos, but she was instructed, you know, make it look nice, make it look like everyone's, you know, got happy family times, don't show the barbed wire, don't show the guns, don't show any of that. So there's a very select and censored version of visual data for incarceration camps, which I think makes it a really interesting exercise to put all of that into a visual graphic novel. These sorts of things that the government specifically didn't want people to see, I want to be able to draw and make them visual. And in that way, sort of pivoting to the other thing that makes that makes it an interesting medium for this story is that one of the first books published after camp in 1946, actually, which is even earlier than I realized, was Mina Ikubo's Citizen 13660, which was a visual diary that Mina Ikubo kept while in camp. She was actually in the same camp that my grandmother was. And she was an illustrator at the time, and she sort of just drew what she saw, not having a camera. It was one of, you know, it was sort of the only visual evidence of a lot of things that she saw. And it so inspired me because it really showed sort of the impact that art can have even in a difficult situation, which is, I think, something artists sort of grapple with all the time, is like, is what I do worthwhile at all? Like, is it helping anybody? And sort of her sort of record of, her visual record was so helpful to me, and really emotionally, and also in terms of just like giving me those visual references to draw on. So
before I go to Gene, I just want to say and clear the, like, on the record that yes, what you do does matter. And like these books alone were so impactful to me. I felt so much, I learned so much, and your books, but just like art in general, like, is so important. So I just want to put that out there, make sure there was no doubt. But on to you, Gene. Can you talk to me about, like, in your bios that you write and sometimes draw stories? Like, what opportunities and challenges did the form of graphics present when telling the story?
Well, thank you for saying that, MJ. You know, I think almost all of us, we probably, like quarantine, some of my cartoonist friends and I joke that quarantine kind of forces everybody to live like a cartoonist, right? Like most of us spend a lot of time by ourselves in front of our drawing table or in front of our tablets, and to hear that it, like what we're doing, you know, quarantining ourselves voluntarily matters. It means a lot.
Yeah.
So for Dragon Hoops, I think what one of the big things that I struggled with was it felt like I was lying. It felt like I was telling this real story through cartoons, and automatically by cartooning it, I was adding a layer of fiction on top. You know, like I was automatically making it so that things just did, like with my style of cartooning, things looked a little cuter than they actually were. You know. And a little cleaner than they actually were. And I was constantly worried about that. I felt like I ultimately had to make peace that, you know, I was trying to show, like, it wasn't necessarily about the accuracy of the visuals. It was more about giving the reader a glimpse of what the world looked like through my eyes, you know, or what that season of basketball looked like through my eyes. But even now, I just think, you know, like people who know the actual people in the book will come up to me and go, yeah, the way you drew him doesn't totally look like what he actually looks like. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. I'm a bad caricaturist.
I found myself going back and forth, but like between reading the book and then Googling, like,
oh, awesome.
And I think I don't know if I have done that during other reading experiences, but like your artwork so brought me to each scene that you were telling that then I was like, oh, this is based on real life. This is a history. I wonder. And so it was, your book was doubly transportive in that way.
Well, thank you, MJ.
I have one last lightning round question. I think we're probably like slightly over time. I am so sorry, Brooklyn Book Festival. But my last lightning round question is, can you tell me what is one piece of advice you would have for a young writer, artist, etc., when they are starting to put their identity and their story on the page? I'm going to start with you, Gene, and then I'll go to Kiku and Mike, but starting with you, Gene.
The one piece of advice I often give that I wish I had when I was starting off is that the voice in your head that tells you that everything that you do on the page is garbage is wrong, and it will also always be there. So you just kind of have to learn to live with it and learn to ignore it.
What about you, Kiku?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great one, and I also wish that I had known that earlier too, but thank you for saying it, Gene. I think my advice is that you know, every part of yourself is worth telling. There's a brief moment of queer romance in my book that I wasn't sure I would get away with, but I put in there anyway. And I'm very glad that I did, because a lot of people have told me that they really appreciated it. Seeing sort of moment of human connection in that way. So that you want to put in there, and then just deal with it later.
I love that. I love that. What about you, Mike?
Yeah, and actually I read Displacement and it's amazing. And I enjoyed that little moment. I'm like, oh, family alert. So my advice would be, you know, be honest with yourself, be honest with your reader. And I always like to tell illustrators to draw things that make you smile. Not necessarily like, you know, flowers and stars. But, you know, illustrators will understand what I'm talking about, where you draw something and you're like legit proud of it, where no one can see you, just kind of like, like it's working. So trying to focus on the joy of creating.
That is fantastic advice. Well, I just wanted to say, Gene, Kiku, Mike, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been incredible, and I wish we could go longer, but just thank you for being here.
Thanks, MJ.
Thank you. Everyone, please remember you can order the link, the books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its 15th year presenting the free literary programming that you are seeing today. I just want to say thank you again. Have a great rest of your afternoons. And if you're watching this, read these books. They're phenomenal. Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, MJ.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.